By now, you've all seen the news, memes, and controversies surrounding PlayStation's failed hero shooter, Concord. In what will go down as one of PlayStation's biggest failures ever, Concord was only online for 14 days before its shutdown. There's been a lot of talk about Concord, with everyone chiming in on how this game got made and what they think tanked the project. I personally feel much of the conversation around this game is missing important details, or focusing on the wrong things that don't actually matter. In today's video, we are going to look back at Concord's development history, release, and shockingly quick demise to figure out exactly what went wrong. There's a quote that has gone around from one of the developers of Concord stating that the game was in development for 8 years. People have really grabbed onto this quote, constantly repeating that Concord took 8 years to make. I don't want to harp on that too much though, because it seems slightly impossible, as Firewalk Studios, the company responsible for Concord, were not even formed until 2018. Other developers have claimed a majority of the work came in the last 4 years, with the other 4 being very early pre-production stages. I think that's an important caveat to mention before I continue. However, at the very least, we know that Concord was first being conceptualized around 8 years ago, and that right there actually tells us a whole lot. Let's think back to 8 years ago. It's summer 2016. The world seems to shine a bit brighter, people haven't quite lost their minds yet, and life is pretty good. Life is also good because a brand new video game had just released a few months prior that had taken the world by storm. That game was, of course, Overwatch, releasing on May 24th, 2016. Overwatch's colorful cast of characters, unique world, and incredibly fun hero shooter gameplay connected with players in a big way. With Blizzard raking in millions, it's no surprise that other companies would want in too. It would seem the first stages of Concord began right around this time, off the heels of Overwatch, with very early character designs and concept brainstorming. If you view Concord through the lens of a game being crafted immediately following Overwatch's release, I think things start to make a whole lot more sense, but more on that later. While Concord may have been in the brainstorming phase immediately following Overwatch's release in 2016, I think it's fair to say development didn't truly begin until 2018 when Firewalk Studios was officially formed. Based in Bellevue, Washington, Firewalk Studios consists primarily of former Destiny and Call of Duty developers from Activision and Bungie. With that much FPS game pedigree, it wasn't hard to guess what kind of game they would be working on. Initially, Firewalk was a subsidiary of Probably Monsters, an independent AAA gaming company that would be assisting development. As Firewalk and Probably Monsters began their work on what would become Concord, they caught the attention of PlayStation. On April 22nd, 2021, PlayStation announced they would be partnering with Firewalk and Probably Monsters to publish a new multiplayer game. Virtually no details about the game itself were given at that time, it was just simply an announcement that it existed and that PlayStation was involved. It came at a time for PlayStation where they were leaning heavily into live service games, trying to find their own crown jewel in the likes of Fortnite. PlayStation announced a ton of these live service collaborations in 2021, including partnerships with not just Firewalk, but also Deviation Games and Haven Studios. Many of PlayStation's first-party teams began work on live service games around this time as well. As the years have gone on, this push for live service games has really rubbed PlayStation players the wrong way. It's no secret that PlayStation's core audience prefers single-player games, and many saw these live service projects as taking away from that. That narrative has only grown stronger as 4 years into the PS5 lifecycle, we still haven't seen new games from some of PlayStation's biggest developers, such as Naughty Dog or Sucker Punch. Those two facts are not necessarily related, but I mention it because the fans' aversion to this live service push means that all of these games have a tough battle in front of them. However, this didn't stop Sony from doubling down on this live service initiative. PlayStation seemed to take a particular liking to Firewalk in their project, as they officially acquired the team into PlayStation Studios in April 2023. Although we still knew nothing about Firewalk's game, PlayStation's commitment to it was seen as a pretty good sign. If they were willing to buy the studio outright, they must have seen something they really liked. PlayStation was betting a lot on this game, and seeing their belief in it was enough to get fans hesitantly excited. Concord was officially revealed for the first time at May 2023's PlayStation Showcase. However, players came away with more questions than answers after this reveal. It was a teaser trailer showing off very little. Pretty much all we learned was that the game would be set in space and that the characters enjoy eating cheeseburgers. In the description of this teaser trailer, they mentioned that it is a PvP multiplayer first-person shooter, but the trailer itself does not mention that at all. It was a strange first reveal that told us nothing. And considering it was a new IP from a new studio, we had nothing to go off of, leading most people to just kind of forget about it. However, I noticed that this teaser has nearly 10,000 dislikes, which seems strangely high for a trailer that showed us virtually nothing. What that is proof of is what I mentioned earlier, with many PlayStation players rejecting this live service initiative, regardless of what the games had to show for themselves. Many fans had already written off Concord before they had even seen more than a moldy CGI burger. After this lukewarm reveal, we didn't hear hear much else from Concord. It took all the way until May 2024 to finally get the full reveal at that month's State of Play. And this time around, I can't blame it all on PlayStation's audience holding a grudge against live service games, as this showcase was kind of disastrous. It starts off with a cinematic trailer featuring the characters of Concord, known as the Free Gunners. The nearly 5-minute cinematic certainly looked gorgeous, but its Marvel-esque quip-filled dialogue was somewhat off-putting. After the cinematic, they showed the gameplay for the first time. As Concord was officially revealed to be a hero shooter, the fan reaction turned extremely negative almost immediately. Hero shooter has become a genre that many have completely written off. Whether it's because they were turned off by Overwatch's decline or because they feel like there's just too many of them now, hero shooter has become a dreaded term. And I think the way they revealed the game, showing the cinematic first and then the gameplay, made this even worse. I'm someone who keeps up with the gaming industry and especially everything going on with PlayStation. So I already knew what Concord was and I was prepared for the reveal of a hero shooter. For someone like me, the cinematic was a pleasant surprise, as I wasn't expecting a game like this to feature cinematics at all, much less one that is so highly produced. However, for those who aren't so in the know, they had no idea what Concord was. As they watched the cinematic trailer, they may have been expecting a traditional PlayStation Studio style single-player game set in a sci-fi world. So when the gameplay starts and it's a live service hero shooter, you could hear the collective groan from the internet. I even remember the phrase "it's a hero shooter" or something along those lines trending on Twitter that day, as everyone reacted the same way in real time. I feel like showing that cinematic first led uninformed viewers astray, as they expected one thing, but then got something much different. Even after the initial shockwaves of another hero shooter settled down, the gameplay trailer didn't do much to sell people on the game. I think at this point I should note that I am not someone who is against hero shooters and/or live service games if done right. Unlike most, I had an open mind for Concord, so while I wasn't furious at its pure existence like so many others, I was quite underwhelmed by what I saw. Nothing in the gameplay trailer looked bad, but none of it made me particularly excited. For many, Concord's cinematic and gameplay reveal was a point of no return, where they refused to give the game a chance. For others, like myself, it was an uninspiring introduction to the world. They did, however, announce a beta would be coming for the game in July, and it was here that we would be able to form our true opinions of Concord before its release. Concord was set to have 2 beta weekends in July. The first beta weekend would take place from July 12th to July 14th, and would only be available to players who pre-ordered the game. Then, the next weekend would be open to anyone, or at least that was the plan. Right before the first pre-order only beta weekend was set to begin, PlayStation announced that anyone with a PS Plus subscription would also be granted access, regardless of if they pre-ordered. This was the first sign that Concord was truly in trouble. It's pretty obvious that pre-order numbers must have been so low that PlayStation was forced to open up the beta to PS Plus members. Despite the beta being opened up to the millions of PS Plus subscribers, there still wasn't much buzz around this first beta weekend. But hey, the game was still locked behind a pre-order for Steam players. Maybe the second weekend would hit harder. Actually, the second beta weekend ended up being even more concerning than the first. With the beta now being fully free to play for both PlayStation and Steam users, you would expect a whole lot of people to jump in and give it a try. But instead, interest remained scarily low. The beta peaked at just around 2,000 concurrent players on Steam. We don't know what the PlayStation numbers looked like, but I don't imagine that it was much better. Considering only a couple thousand people could be bothered to download the game for free, it's hard to imagine any of them shelling out $40 for it at launch. For those who were playing the game, overall impressions seemed decent. The game was certainly well made and the gameplay was solid, but it was nothing to write home about, and people weren't exactly rushing to tell their friends to go and download it. There just simply wasn't a lot of interest in the beta, even with it being free. As we inched closer to Concord's release date, fans were understandably worried. With interest in the beta and the game itself being so low, many debated whether PlayStation should even release the game at all. At the very least, it seemed like a delay could help, potentially to transition the game to a free-to-play model. But PlayStation chose not to do that, instead heading straight for release with the plan they had in place. Honestly, I can't blame them for doing this. PlayStation had a massive success story with Helldivers 2 earlier this year, launching at the same $40 price point. Before that game launched, some had concerns about that price as well, but once good word of mouth spread and the game started trending, no one had any issue paying that cost. Perhaps Sony thought the same would happen here, with word of mouth carrying Concord to a surprise fan base. Or maybe PlayStation just didn't want to deal with the headache anymore and felt the extra time and money it would take to transition to free-to-play wouldn't be worth it. Whatever the reason was, Concord released as intended, and the results were even worse than I think anyone could have anticipated. Listen, I didn't expect Concord to do well, and it didn't exactly take an expert to figure that out. Everyone could see it. But even though we all knew the game would fail, the level to which it failed was still startling. Concord was finally released on August 23, 2024, and as the day went on, it was clear that the game was struggling big time. On Concord's launch date, it only managed a peak concurrent player count of 697 players on Steam. Now, I'm personally getting a bit tired of people bringing up Steam player counts all the time. People use it as the be-all end-all for everything simply because it's an easily accessible number. All I'm trying to say is it doesn't always tell the full story when a game is also available on other platforms. But in the case of Concord, it's relevant because less than 700 concurrent players on launch day isn't just bad, it's genuinely unheard of. Let's compare it to some of the other recent gaming flops to really paint the picture. Again, since this is all only accounting for Steam players, it's relevant and we can take something from it. The Avengers game from Square Enix, which was such a disaster that the game has now been completely delisted from online storefronts, had a peak player count of 31,165. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, which has reportedly lost $250 million for Warner Brothers, had a peak player count of 13,459. And Xbox's Redfall, a game so bad that its developer Arcane Austin has been shut down, had a peak player count of 6,124. Meanwhile, Concord couldn't even crack 700 total concurrent players. This was more than a game not quite hitting the mark. This was a game that had been universally rejected by the gaming world. I mean, for a game to get shunned like this, it must have been pretty horrible, right? Not quite. At its core, Concord was a solid first-person shooter. It was well made with stunning graphics and tight gameplay. Concord was content complete and stable at launch, an increasingly rare feat in modern AAA gaming, especially in the multiplayer scene. But that's not to say the game did everything right. The biggest issue is that Concord's characters were just not good enough, a particularly damning thing to say about a hero shooter. This is probably the point in the video where some of you want me to start talking about DEI and complaining about pronouns, but that's not what we do on this channel. The reality is, these characters are poorly designed, not because they are diverse, but for a multitude of other reasons. The designs range from okay to wildly generic to just straight up strange looking. One character in particular that has caught a lot of flack is Roka. Roka's design is essentially a fully beige astronaut suit with red on the front of the helmet. How is this the final model that made it into the game? It's generic and basic, lacking any defining characteristics that make the character memorable. And I could say the same about a lot of Concord's free gunners. Compare it to other hero shooters like Overwatch or Team Fortress 2. Obviously, the characters in those two games are well designed, but more importantly, they feature an art style and aesthetic that makes them fit together and represent their respective games. If you showed someone who had never played video games before a couple TF2 characters or a couple Overwatch characters, they would pretty quickly be able to identify all the others. But with Concord, it's just a jumbled mess of random people. Some are aliens, some are humans, some are robots, some are a mix of alien and human, all with no explanation or reasoning for any of it. Even moving aside their poor designs, I also felt the way the characters played in the game was disappointing. I will give them credit for giving each character a unique kit that felt different from one another. Also, I felt each character was pretty easy to pick up and play, immediately recognizing their strengths and weaknesses. That is a sign of really good game design. But I had one fundamental issue that I haven't seen a ton of people mention. None of the abilities of the characters really flowed together or played off one another. There are no team abilities or synergies, which made the lobbies feel more like a Call of Duty team deathmatch rather than a team-based hero shooter. One of the most defining features of a hero shooter is the way the abilities can work together as a team. And on the other hand, you have counter picks between the characters, adding to the strategy and mind games of every match. Concord just simply doesn't have that. Ultimately, this left me wondering why Concord was a hero shooter at all, and I think this made Concord stick out in a way that didn't really appeal to any one crowd the right way. For all the talk of comparing this game to Overwatch or calling it PlayStation Overwatch, Concord didn't actually play like Overwatch at all. It played much more similar to something like Destiny PvP or Call of Duty. The only difference was that it had hero abilities, something fans of a game like Call of Duty probably wouldn't be interested in. Meanwhile, an Overwatch fan would be bored out of their minds at the slower paced gameplay and lack of meaningful objective play. Concord tried to play both sides, catering to everyone, but in the end, appealed to no one. The next big focus of Concord was on its cinematics, including the planned weekly vignettes that would be released throughout the seasons of the game. These cinematics appeared to be a big focus for Firewalk, and it was something that made Concord differ from its competitors, which typically feature no form of in-game story at all. So while I can respect them for trying something different, I think these cinematics may have actually been the thing that sunk Concord. Firewalk spent so much time creating these super high quality cinematics, including motion capture and all the rest. That does not come cheap, both in terms of manpower and money. It seems to me me like what they were going for was the level of cinematic graphic fidelity you would expect to see from other PlayStation Studios games. But that just isn't necessary for a multiplayer shooter, and I can't help but wonder how much faster they may have been able to finish this game if they didn't spend so much time on this aspect. If we assume all the time and money they spent mocapping and creating these cinematics had been put into the game instead, maybe they could have gotten it out a few years sooner, allowing Concord to release into a market that would have been much more accepting of it. As for the cinematics themselves, they do look great, but the writing is awful. The whole cast of characters, tone, and themes come across as a Guardians of the Galaxy parody, and when I say that, I mean it literally. Concord really does toe the line of being inspired by something versus full-on copying something. Many of the characters feature similar designs or characteristics to those of the Guardians. Perhaps Concord living a longer life could have addressed my issues. Maybe the weekly vignettes would have given us more lore about each character and made us like them more and more. And maybe as players got better and more competitive at the game, we would have seen strategies and metas form around the abilities like I was looking for. But for now, all I can do is judge what we got. And as I do that, it's pretty clear why exactly Concord failed. It's a fundamentally solid game, hidden under layers of unappealing characters, half-baked hero shooter elements, and painfully unoriginal cinematics. I can't say I'm surprised that most gamers were completely uninterested. With Concord's already low player count steadily dropping with each passing day, it was clear that the game had failed. Reports began coming out stating that the game had only managed to sell a measly 25,000 copies across both PS5 and Steam. It was the worst case scenario for PlayStation and Firewalk. They probably could have lived with a couple thousand people playing, living out hope that their small game could one day boom with more seasonal updates and post-launch support. But with virtually only a couple hundred people playing at a given time, that just wasn't realistic. So here's what I thought would happen. I thought Sony would move the game to PlayStation Plus in 3 to 6 months, allowing for most PlayStation players to get in for free, buffing up the player count and hopefully hooking some people. Then, in another 3 to 6 months, they would transition to fully free to play for everyone. If at that point the game still hadn't taken off, they would shut it down. Instead, PlayStation decided to skip a few steps and went nuclear right away. On September 3rd, 2024, a PlayStation blog post went live explaining that Concord servers would be taken offline on September 6th, exactly 2 weeks after the game officially launched. Additionally, PlayStation would be offering refunds to everyone who bought the game. I'm not sure we've ever seen something like this from a AAA game before. Sure, we've seen plenty of live service games come and go, but typically, they will get given at least a year or so of support before shutdown. Concord got 14 days. I'm utterly stunned that PlayStation chose to pull the plug that quickly. Frankly, if you weren't ready to see this out and try to make it work, I'm not sure why you would release the game at all. Were they really so stubborn and closed-minded that they thought the game would be a success despite all of the signs saying otherwise? Concord's final days online became a complete joke, as the remaining player base, consisting primarily of trophy hunters, desperately tried to get their platinum trophies before it became unobtainable. What they found was that the quickest way to level up would be to play the no respawn game mode and continually jump off the map to get through matches as quickly as they could. So, as the hours ticked towards Concord's demise, its players spent that time repeatedly killing themselves over and over again. A depressingly poetic ending. Concord's failure can be traced back to a few key mistakes. A poor presentation of their world and characters turned off players immediately. Meanwhile, its hero shooter gameplay and live service branding is not the popular selling point it once was amongst gamers, instead now doing the exact opposite. And to that point, too much time was spent on unnecessary things like expensive cinematics, causing Concord to miss its window of potential relevance it could have had back in the late 2010s or even very early 2020s. And so that is the story of Concord, at least for now. The wording of the PlayStation blog post made it seem like they weren't ruling out a potential return. Specifically, the line stating, "At this time, we have decided to take the game offline beginning September 6, 2024, and explore options, including those that will better reach our players." That sounds to me like they would be looking at ways to relaunch. However, I'm not convinced this line wasn't just thrown in there to keep the door open. No definitive plan has been laid out, and with many of the Firewalk developers tweeting out their goodbyes to Concord over the last few days, it doesn't sound like a team gearing up to continue working on the project. I hate to say it, but I don't think a relaunch is a good idea. We already saw from the open beta that a transition to free-to-play still probably wouldn't do much to draw people in, and at this point, the entire Concord branding is just too tainted. But then again, with so much time and money already spent on the game, PlayStation may be determined to try and find a way to fix this. But for now, Concord is dead, and will forever be remembered as one of, if not the biggest first-party flop to ever come out of PlayStation.